was 15 years old when this happened, and honestly, I'm lucky I got out. Back then, I was always looking for ways to make extra money. I was too young to get a real job, so I would babysit for families around my town. Most of the time, it was people my parents knew or neighbors who needed someone to watch their kids for a few hours. Nothing crazy, just easy money for a teenager. One afternoon during summer break, I was browsing Craigslist and came across an ad from a woman looking for a babysitter. She worked overnight shifts and needed someone to stay at her house with her 6-year-old daughter, a girl named Rose. According to the ad, Rose would already be asleep by the time I arrived and would stay asleep most of the night. The pay was really good for what sounded like the easiest job in the world. I emailed her and got a response within the hour. She asked for my number and called me that same evening. She sounded completely normal, calm, friendly. She answered every question I had without hesitation. She explained that she had to leave for work before I arrived, so she would hide a key outside and told me exactly where to find it. Since I was only 15, my mom wanted to talk to her first. The woman spent several minutes on the phone with my mom. Whatever they talked about must have gone well, because afterward, my mom smiled and told me it sounded like a great opportunity. The job was set for the following night at around 9:30 p.m. When the time came, my mom drove me to the address. The house was in a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes from where we lived. It sat near the end of a dead-end street, surrounded by large trees on all sides. As we pulled into the driveway, I noticed that every single light inside the house was on. My mom waited while I walked up to the front porch and found the key exactly where the woman said it would be. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. I set my backpack down, turned around, and waved goodbye to my mom as she backed out of the driveway. Then, I was alone. The house was dead quiet. I figured Rose was already asleep, just like her mom said. I looked around, and at first glance, everything seemed totally normal. Family photos on the walls, a few toys near the living room couch, a pink backpack leaning against a chair, kids' drawings stuck to the fridge with magnets. Everything looked fine. I wanted to get a feel for the layout, so I started walking through the first floor. The kitchen connected to a hallway that led towards several bedrooms. As I stepped into that hallway, I glanced through an open doorway on my right, and I stopped. There was a man standing inside the room. He was facing the window, just staring out into the darkness, which made absolutely no sense because it was pitch black outside. There was nothing out there to look at. I stood there for several seconds, just staring at him, before I finally said something. The second I made a sound, he turned around. The first thing I noticed was his smile. The second thing I noticed was that one of his front teeth was missing.
I asked him who he was. His smile never changed. He didn't answer. I backed away from the doorway and pulled out my phone and called the woman. She picked up after a few rings. I told her there was a man standing in one of the bedrooms. She went quiet for a second, like she was confused, and then it was like she suddenly remembered something. That part still sticks with me to this day. She told me it was her brother. She said he had dementia and that he sometimes wandered around at night. She told me not to worry because he was completely harmless. That did not make me feel better, not even a little. If her brother lived there, why wasn't he mentioned in the ad? Why didn't she bring him up during our phone call? Before hanging up, she told me to help myself to anything in the fridge and that I could sleep in the guest room at the end of the hallway.
After the call, I just stood there for a minute, thinking. Eventually, I decided to check out the rest of the hallway. The room where the man had been standing was still open, but he was no longer visible from the doorway. That made me more nervous, not less. I kept walking. There were 4 doors besides the guest room. I tried the first one, locked. Second one, locked. Third one, locked. The fourth one opened about 3 inches before stopping. I looked through the crack. The lights were off, and I couldn't see much. I pushed it a little further. just an empty room. I felt stupid for being so scared. I kept walking toward the guest room. But as I passed the fridge again, something made me stop. The drawings, the ones stuck to the fridge with magnets. I looked closer and realized they looked old, really old. The paper had yellowed around the edges. One of them had dust sitting on top of the magnet, holding it in place. The pink backpack I saw earlier looked faded too, worn out, like it hadn't been touched in years. I stood there and thought about it. I had been in that house for almost half an hour, and I had not seen a single sign that a child currently lived there. No recent toys, no sound from any bedroom, nothing that felt like it belonged to a little girl who had just gone to sleep an hour ago. Where was Rose? I reached the guest room at the end of the hallway. Small room. I set my backpack on the floor and turned around to look back down the hall. And there he was again, the man, standing at the opposite end of the hallway, staring directly at me. I hadn't heard him move, not a single footstep. It was like he had just appeared there. Even from that distance, I could see the missing tooth as his smile spread across his face. We stared at each other for what felt like a long time. Then I stepped into the room and shut the door. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to calm myself down. I knew about dementia. My great-grandmother had passed away with it, so I understood how it could make someone act strange. I kept trying to tell myself that's all this was. But something felt wrong. Deep down, I knew it. I called my mom 3 times before she picked up. I told her everything, the man, the locked doors, the fact that I couldn't find any sign of Rose anywhere in the house. She went silent for a moment. Then she told me she was coming to get me right now. Hearing that made me feel relieved and terrified at the same time, because even my mom thought something was off. She hung up and said she'd be there as fast as she could. A few minutes passed. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway coming toward my room. I sat completely still. The footsteps got closer and closer until they stopped directly outside my door. Silence. I stared at the doorknob. I tried calling the woman again, 3 times. She never picked up. Then the door opened. Just a few inches, not wide enough for me to see who was standing on the other side. Just open, sitting there. Whoever was on the other side didn't come in. They just stood there. That was enough for me. I got off the bed, moved to the window, and forced it open. I climbed out and dropped into the backyard. Then I ran. I didn't stop until I was nearly a block away from the house. I pulled out my phone to call my mom, and that's when a text message came through. It was from the woman's number. It said, "Where are you going?" I spun around and looked back toward the house. I didn't see anyone outside. I didn't see anyone at the windows. I hadn't seen a single camera when I was inside, but somehow she knew I had left. I called my mom and told her not to come to the house. I told her to pick me up further down the street. 10 minutes later, she pulled up and I jumped in and locked the door. We never contacted that woman again. I never found out who the man really was. I never found out if Rose actually existed. I never found out why every single bedroom door was locked. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe it was all real and I was just a paranoid teenager who ran for no reason. But that text message, she knew the second I left, and I never figured out how. Whatever was going on in that house, I'm just glad I got out when I did.
This happened about a year ago, and honestly, I'm still not fully over it. My name is Noah Reed. I'm 19 years old and I live in the outskirts of Toronto. Not in the city itself, but close enough. It was the beginning of monsoon season. The sky was heavy and gray, the kind of weather that just presses down on you all day. My unit exams had just finished. I was exhausted but relieved. Then, 2 days later, my college sent a message in the group chat. Academic break due to infrastructure work. 3 months. They were renovating the entire building, fixing the leakages, the ceilings, mold, cracked walls, rewiring, and etc. So they gave us a 3-month break. Basically, 3 months of freedom. And I knew exactly what I wanted to do with that free time. I had been wanting a PS5 for a while, but my dad had one clear condition. He told me straight up, focus on your studies first. Once you're doing well, then we'll talk about the PS5. So school always came first. But now exams were over, and I suddenly had 3 full months with nothing to do. I thought about it for a while, and then an idea hit me. What if I earned the PS5 myself? I went to my dad and told him I wanted to get a job during the break to make some money. He didn't hesitate. He looked at me, smiled, and said he was really proud of me for thinking that way. He agreed right away. That meant everything to me. I went to sleep that night feeling excited. The next morning I woke up, had breakfast, and headed out to look for a job. I wanted to work at a gas station because the pay was decent. Around 20 Canadian dollars per hour for a 6-hour shift. The nearest station was 2.6 kilometers from my house. I walked in and asked if they were hiring, but they weren't. So I kept going. The next one was 6.7 kilometers away. It was farther than I wanted, but I didn't mind if it meant making money. When I arrived, I noticed right away how isolated the place was. Just the road, trees, and open space around it. I asked about the job. They were hiring, but the manager said the only available shift was nights. I didn't want night shifts at a place like that. I asked if mornings were possible. He thought for a second and replied, "Yeah, I can make that work." $21.89 per hour. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. I worked 16 days straight, and honestly, it was fine. The morning shifts were steady with a decent number of customers. Nothing weird, just normal work. I would go to work, serve people, go home, eat my lunch, play video games, hang out with friends, and repeat. I was getting closer to that PS5 every single day, and that motivation kept me going. Then came the 17th day. I showed up in the evening instead. At 7 p.m., much later than usual. I thought it would be fine. I apologized to the manager as soon as I walked in and told him I had some things to take care of. He nodded and said it was okay. The sun was already setting, and the station felt quieter than I was used to. A different kind of quiet. I figured I'd just push through the shift, finish it, and head back home. I had absolutely no idea what was coming. By around 10 in the evening, the crowd had completely died out. That's the thing about late shifts. The daytime energy is just gone. No families stopping for gas, no commuters, just empty pumps, silence, and the sound of the wind outside. That's when the manager came up to me and said he had to step out for a while. He told me he'd be back in about an hour. I said no problem, and he left. I was alone. The station felt different at night, smaller somehow. The fluorescent lights inside seemed too bright against the darkness outside. I couldn't see past the tree line, just complete blackness beyond the trees. For the first 35 minutes, everything was fine. I was sitting behind the counter, scrolling through reels on my phone, killing time. Then I heard a sound coming from far off in the trees. It's a pretty wild area around there. It was this deep, low animal sound, the kind that doesn't feel right. The kind that makes your body react before your brain even processes it. The sound stopped. There was complete silence. So I put my phone down, went back to scrolling, and told myself it was just wildlife. About 9 minutes later, I heard something else. This time, it was closer, way closer, coming from the back storage room. It was a scraping sound, like something dragging slowly across the floor. I put my phone down and listened. It kept going, slow and deliberate. My first thought was that an animal had gotten in, maybe a deer or a coyote coming through the back. It happens in areas like that. I grabbed my phone and a flashlight and walked to the back to check it out. I pushed open the storage room door and swept the light across the room. There was nothing. Everything was exactly where it should be, shelves, boxes, equipment, all normal. I stood there for a moment, feeling stupid. I almost laughed at myself. Then I turned to leave, and I heard it again. Except this time, it wasn't coming from inside the room. It was coming from the other side of the emergency exit door. Something was standing right outside that door. I don't know what came over me, but I walked up to the door and smacked it hard with my palm, trying to scare off whatever was out there. Like, okay, whatever it is, just go away. A deer, a coyote, I don't care, just leave. The scraping stopped immediately. Then there was silence, followed by a voice, low, deep, but disturbingly calm. It sounded like a completely normal person casually saying, "Come here." I felt everything in my body freeze. I looked down at the gap at the bottom of the emergency exit door, and right there on the other side, I saw it, a shadow. Someone was standing just inches away from me, with only that door between us. It wasn't an animal. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. My legs were frozen, and I couldn't think straight. Something snapped in me and I fucking ran straight to the front of the station. I don't even remember thinking, my body just took over. I grabbed an iron rod we kept near the counter. I don't know why. I just needed something in my hands. I burst through the front door into the parking lot. Nobody was there. I stood there gripping that rod with both hands, my heart absolutely pounding. I kept looking left and right, scanning everything. I didn't move. I just stood there waiting for something to come out, but nothing did. I pulled out my phone and called the cops. Then I counted every single second. 3 minutes and 49 seconds. I know it sounds crazy specific, but I was so scared I needed something to focus on. When those cop cars finally pulled into the parking lot, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in what felt like forever. I was still holding that iron rod when the officers got out. They already knew why they were there. They'd been searching for a man who was a drug addict who had been wandering around that stretch of road, acting completely erratic. They found him not long after, hiding in a room right near the storage area at the back of the station. To this day, I still don't know how he managed to lock himself in there. The officers didn't waste any time. They smashed the door off its hinges like it was nothing. The man was crouched behind some bags in the corner, trying to hide. One of the officers pulled him out by his hair. He resisted for just a second before the officer knocked him out with a clean punch. Just like that, it was over. I stood there watching everything happen. Then the cops drove me home themselves. I sat in the back of the police car the whole ride, staring out the window. I didn't say a single word. When we got home that night, the officers came inside and told my dad everything that had happened. I just stood there listening. After they left, I sat down with my dad and told him the whole story again, my version, from start to finish. Everything I felt, everything I heard. He listened quietly without interrupting me once. When I was done, he looked me in the eyes and hugged me tight. I had never felt that safe in my entire life. A few days later, a letter arrived at the house. I opened it, not knowing what to expect. Inside was a compensation letter for 999 Canadian dollars. For the trauma and the bruises I got when I ran out of the station in a panic. To be honest, I felt physically fine after just a day. My dad and I went back to the gas station together. The manager saw us walk in, and the look on his face was genuinely empathetic. He wasn't just professionally sorry, he actually felt bad. He handed me 2,000 Canadian dollars in cash on the spot. After that, my dad drove home and picked up my mom, my little sister, and my older brother. We all went out for a nice family lunch together, laughing, eating, and just being normal. Then we went and bought the PS5. I finally got what I had worked for. I earned it myself. But sometimes, even now, when I think back to that night, I freeze for a second. That incident still haunts me. Still, I'm okay now. I'm grateful I'm safe because I got out. And not everyone does. I've always been the kind of person who goes after what they want. Even as a kid, I was always looking for ways to hustle, ways to make things happen. So when an opportunity came up during the summer to make some decent money, I didn't think twice. My mom knew an older couple through a church group. Their names were Richard and Elaine, both in their late 60s. They lived about 40 minutes away from us in a pretty rural area. One of those old farmhouses sitting at the end of a long gravel driveway with thick woods stretching out behind the property. The deal was simple. I'd stay with them for just over a week, help Richard with yard work, cleaning out the garage, moving furniture, painting the fence, things like that. In return, they'd pay me at the end of the stay. My mom trusted Richard. She'd known him for years. And the first time I met Elaine, she seemed really sweet, quiet, but warm. She kept smiling and asking me if I was hungry every 5 minutes. The house itself was exactly what you'd expect. Old, calm, peaceful. The kind of place where nothing ever seems to happen. I should have known that was exactly the kind of place where everything does. Richard showed me around the property on my first day. Big yard, old shed out back, plenty of work to keep me busy for the week. He gave me a rundown of everything we'd be working on, and Elaine made dinner that evening. I noticed pretty quickly that Elaine didn't talk much. She'd sit at the table with this quiet half smile on her face, peaceful almost. But every now and then she'd ask me my name, not in a confused way at first, just casually, like she'd simply forgotten we'd already been introduced. Richard would just say she forgets things sometimes, and I figured that was normal for someone her age, so I didn't think much of it. That first night I went upstairs around 11 and tried to sleep. Somewhere around 3 in the morning I woke up to footsteps in the hallway, slow and steady, someone walking back and forth just outside my door. I told myself it was probably Richard going to the bathroom, but the footsteps never went anywhere. They just passed my door, went down the hall, turned around and came back. I laid there in the dark listening for maybe 10 minutes until they stopped directly outside my door. I stared at the gap underneath, and I could see it. The outline of 2 feet just standing there, completely still, not moving at all. After a while, the footsteps moved away again, and I finally let out a breath I didn't even realize I was holding. But sleep didn't come easy after that. I just laid there staring at the ceiling until morning came. I mentioned it to Richard while we were outside working the next day, and he didn't look surprised at all. He just said Elaine sometimes wandered at night because she had bad dreams and got confused and told me not to worry about it. I asked if I should lock my door, and he kind of laughed and said the guest room didn't have a lock because the house was so old, so I just let it go and tried to move on with the day. But the second night was worse. I woke up again to the same footsteps, except this time they were faster, and I could hear Elaine muttering to herself out in the hallway. I couldn't make out most of what she was saying, but then I heard my name once, and that gave me goosebumps all over. Her shadow passed under my door 3 or 4 times, and then the doorknob twisted, stopped, and the door opened about an inch, just a crack, and through that crack came a whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the voice, low and close, right on the other side of that door, and then just like that it shut again, and the hallway went quiet. I told Richard exactly what happened the next morning, and once again he explained it away, saying she probably thought the room was empty, and that she'd been doing things like that more lately. He said it was embarrassing for her and asked me not to bring it up around Elaine, which I agreed to. During the day she seemed mostly fine, making lunch, folding towels, and watering the plants outside, which honestly made the whole thing harder to process because she just seemed like a sweet old woman going about her day. But every now and then I'd catch her staring at me from across the room with this flat, suspicious look on her face, like she didn't recognize me but also didn't like that I was there. On the 4th day, Richard and I were cleaning out a shed behind the house, and I noticed something shoved behind some boxes in the corner, a dented metal walker, and next to it a broken picture frame with dried brown stains on the glass. I didn't say anything about it, but it stuck with me. Later that same day, when I went inside to use the bathroom, I noticed a long scratch running along the hallway wall at about chest height, like something had been dragged across it, and one of the doors downstairs had small holes in it, like someone had hit it with something hard, over and over again. And standing there looking at all of that, I started to feel like the story I was being told didn't quite match the house I was standing in. That night, I pushed my suitcase in front of the bedroom door before I went to sleep. It wasn't heavy enough to stop anyone, but I figured it would at least make some noise if the door started to open. Around 2:30 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of the suitcase scraping across the floor, and when I looked over, the bedroom door was already halfway open. Elaine was standing in the doorway in her nightgown, mouth hanging open, breathing heavy through her mouth in this slow, awful way that I could hear from across the room. I said her name, trying to keep my voice calm, even though everything in me was anything but calm, and when she stepped further into the room, that's when I saw it. She was holding a kitchen knife down at her side, just carrying it like it was nothing, like she didn't even know it was there. She walked all the way to the side of the bed and stood over me whispering something, and it took me a few seconds to make out what she was saying, but once I did, I couldn't unhear it. She just kept repeating the same words over and over in this low, flat voice. "You don't belong here. You don't belong here. You don't belong here." And she said it maybe 5 or 6 times, standing right there above, me with that knife hanging at her side, before I finally snapped and screamed for Richard as loud as I could. Elaine flinched when I screamed, like the sound genuinely startled her, and then she turned and marched straight out of the room in this stiff, robotic way that was somehow more unsettling than everything else. She slammed the door behind her, and I could hear her footsteps going back down the hall. Richard came upstairs about 30 seconds later, looking more annoyed than concerned, like I'd woken him up over nothing. And when I told him she had been standing over me with a kitchen knife, he just kept saying she wouldn't hurt anyone, that she wasn't herself at night, that I needed to calm down. That was the moment his whole calm, reasonable act started to genuinely make me angry, because this wasn't wandering in the hallway anymore. This wasn't a whisper through a cracked door. She had walked into my room with a knife and stood over my bed, and he was still trying to explain it away. I told him I wanted to go home, and he said it was 3 in the morning, and my mom was probably asleep, and that we'd talk about it in the morning, and I should have called her right then and there. But I didn't want to make things bigger than they already were, so I pushed the dresser in front of the door after he left and sat awake until the sun came up. And the whole time I kept thinking about that knife, and the way she said it, "You don't belong here," like she meant every single word. The next morning, Elaine was back to her usual self, making pancakes, smiling, and giving off this warm grandmother energy like nothing had happened. And that contrast was somehow the most disturbing part of all of it, because I couldn't recognize the woman standing at that stove with the woman who had stood over me with a knife a few hours before. Richard pulled me aside and apologized, but it didn't feel genuine. It felt rehearsed. And when I asked him directly if she had ever attacked anyone before, he paused, just for a second, and then said she had gotten upset with a caregiver once, but that it had been handled. And that one pause told me everything I needed to know. He had been hiding things from me the entire time. I told him again that I wanted to leave, and he said he understood, but asked me to stay one more day so we could finish the last job, and he'd drive me home in the morning and pay me what he owed. And I agreed, which I know sounds crazy, but I needed the money, and I genuinely thought one more night would be fine. That was the kind of logic I was running on, and looking back now, I can see exactly how wrong I was to stay even one more hour in that house. That afternoon, while Richard was outside on the phone, I went looking for my backpack because I wanted to start packing early and get ready to leave first thing in the morning. But when I found it, something stopped me cold. There was a blood stain on the outer pocket, clear as day, and I stood there staring at it, trying to make sense of how it got there. I called Richard inside and showed it to him, and something shifted in his face. Not concern, more like irritation. He grabbed the backpack and told me he had accidentally cut himself earlier and moved it while he was cleaning up, finishing it off with a casual stop, worrying about it like that was supposed to be enough. But something about the way he said it made my stomach drop, because the stain wasn't small, and it wasn't fresh, and it didn't look like any accident to me. I told him I was calling my mom right then, and he tried to calm me down again, so I went upstairs and tried anyway. But the call failed twice, and my text wouldn't send either. And when I asked Richard for the Wi-Fi password, he refused to give it to me. And that was the moment everything shifted, because it wasn't just a creepy old woman with dementia anymore. Now I was in a house in the middle of nowhere with no signal, no Wi-Fi, a bloody backpack, and a man who had been lying to me from the very beginning. And I realized I had no way out until morning. The final night I didn't even get into bed. I sat fully dressed on top of the blanket with my shoes on, and my bag packed right next to me, just waiting for morning to come. Around midnight, Richard came upstairs and told me to move the dresser away from the door because it was a fire hazard. I refused at first, but then he raised his voice, and it was the first time I'd heard him actually yell. He told me to move it now in a tone that made it clear it wasn't a request anymore, so I moved it just enough for the door to open. And after he left, I sat back down in the dark with my phone in my hand and just waited. Around 2 in the morning, I heard Elaine downstairs, except this time she wasn't wandering quietly. She was yelling, and I could hear Richard saying her name over and over, trying to calm her down, and then there was a loud crash like glass shattering, and then a heavy thud followed by Richard crying out in pain, and the house just went silent for a second before I heard footsteps, fast ones, coming straight for the stairs. I got up and shoved the dresser back against the door as hard as I could, but a few seconds later Elaine hit it from the other side and the doorknob started rattling violently, and through the door I could hear her voice again. "You don't belong here. You don't belong here," over and over, except this time she wasn't whispering, she was screaming now. And the door shook as she hit it again and again, and then I heard something metal strike the wood, and a piece of the door splintered inward, and I knew right then that I wasn't waiting anymore. I looked at the window and made my decision. I got it open and kicked out the screen and climbed out onto the small porch roof that sat just below the window. I could still hear her on the other side of that door as I crouched on that roof in the dark, looking down at the bushes below. And then I just jumped. I dropped into the bushes and hit the ground hard and didn't stop. I ran straight down that long gravel driveway without looking back once, and I could hear the front door open behind me and Elaine's voice carrying out into the night air, still screaming those same words, still holding what I could only make out in the dark as a fireplace poker raised in one hand. I didn't stop running until I hit the road and got enough signal to call 911. I stood there on the side of that dark road in the middle of nowhere, breathing hard and shaking and just trying to get the words out. The police and an ambulance showed up about 15 minutes later. Richard had a cut on his head and a broken wrist from trying to stop her, and Elaine was taken away by paramedics, and I just stood there watching it all happen, feeling like I was watching someone else's life. My mom arrived as soon as she could, and I've never been so relieved to see someone in my entire life. I didn't say much on the ride home. I just sat there in the passenger seat staring out the window while everything that had happened over the past week slowly started to sink in. Later that night, Richard told my mom everything, that Elaine had been getting progressively worse for months, but he couldn't bring himself to put her in a facility because he felt too guilty, that he thought he could manage it on his own. And then he admitted that she had attacked 2 caregivers before me, 2 people he never mentioned, 2 situations he knew about and said nothing. And if Richard wasn't an elderly man with a broken wrist, my mom probably would have done a lot more than just stare at him the way she did. Looking back now, I think about all the signs I ignored. The walker behind the boxes, the scratches on the wall, the holes in the door, the blood on my backpack, and the way Richard always had an explanation ready before I even finished talking. And I keep coming back to the same thought, that we as people want things to be normal for as long as possible. We hold on to that hope, even when everything around us is telling us to let go. And sometimes we don't see the danger we're actually in until we're already standing at the edge of a roof in the dark with nowhere left to go but down.